right, good afternoon and welcome to our virtual panel discussion, The Experiences of Asian American Women, made possible by the Greater Cincinnati Chinese Cultural Exchange Association and the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library. I'm David Siders, Civic Engagement Coordinator from your public library, and we present our event to you today in honor of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We are so proud of our partnership with the Greater Cincinnati Chinese Cultural Exchange Association. Many thanks to the GCCCEA. And again, as housekeeping, we are recording today's event to allow it to be evergreen on our library's YouTube channel so that additional community members may be able to view. If you do prefer to turn your camera off, please do so now. Also, we will have some time at the end of the discussion today for questions and answer or Q&A session. So please place your questions in the chat during our discussion today, and we hope to get to your questions during the Q&A time. Without further ado, I am so happy to introduce Felicity Tao, co-founder and co-chair of the Greater Cincinnati Chinese Cultural Exchange Association, who will introduce us to our distinguished panelists of our event today. Welcome, Felicity.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, for the kickoff. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in discussing this very important topic, the experiences of Asian American women. My name is Felicity Tao. As David introduced, I am the co-founder and co-chair of Greater Cincinnati Chinese Cultural Exchange Association, a nonprofit dedicated to celebrate Asian American heritage and fostering cross-cultural dialogues. I'm also a board member of Cincinnati Campus, an immigrant advocacy nonprofit. I will be moderating today's conversation. We're very, very fortunate to have this conversation with an excellent panel today. I will ask our distinguished panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Professor Judy Wu, then Maki Somosot, followed by Mayor Aftab Pureval.
Thank you. For some reason, I was not able to unmute myself. I'm very happy to join you today. My name is Judy Wu. I'm a professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. But I taught for many years at Ohio State University, and my older son is coming back to Ohio. He'll be going to school at Case Western. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about some very difficult topics, but I'm so glad to be having the conversation.
Judy. Hi, everyone. My name is Maki Somosot. I am the Comms and Narrative Director for the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, the co-lead for Kaarawan Filipinx caucus with OPAWL, building grassroots AAPI leadership. And I'm really excited to be with you all here today. And like Professor Judy said, it's going to be some very difficult topics, but I think the only way out is through. So I'm glad that you'll be with us and be a captive audience.
I think that's me. Felicity, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this panel. David in the library, thanks so much for creating this this forum for all of us. As the only man on the panel, my strategy for today is to speak as little as possible and to learn. But I am very proud to be here as the mayor of Cincinnati. I am half Tibetan and half Indian, and very proud of my Asian American background. So thank you so much.
And Mayor, thank you so much. And you know, we always want to have as many allies as possible with men and women. So thank you so much. Well, let's delve into the conversation. For the participants, again, please feel free to drop your comments and questions in the chat. We will address some of them in the end if we have a few minutes left. So first question, historically, how Asian women were portrayed by Western men in colonial times, and how were they depicted in Hollywood movies and American media over the time? And what were the consequences of those perceptions? I will ask Professor Wu to respond first, and then maybe followed by Maki.
Thank you so much, Felicity. It's a really big question. One set of ideas I want to introduce you to is the concept of Orientalism. And this is a title of a book by a scholar, Edward Said. And he talks about how Westerners tend to perceive the East as its opposite. So the West presents itself as modern, scientific. It projects that the East is its opposite, so that it's tradition bound, that it's backwards. And it's also gendered. So the West is represented by men, by their commitment to rationality, whereas the East as a whole is often feminized. It's seen as not having masculinity, as being exotic, as erotic, and that gets really concentrated into the representations that women associate with the East. And Maki can say more in terms of media representation. But I also just want to emphasize that colonial times is not in the past, it's in the present. So if you think about the United States having territories, right, that these are locations in which the United States has political authority, has military control, but the people who live in those locations do not have the full political rights as people who live in the States or who are US citizens. So these are ideas that emerged over time, but they still very much are present with us, as is the structure of colonialism.
Thank you, Professor Judy. I'm so glad that you actually brought up Orientalism, because that was crucial at college and really kind of formed the basis for my understanding, you know, as an Asian American woman, as a Filipino woman, grew up in the Philippines and immigrated to the States. But just as a follow-up to sort of the media representations and how Asian American women are depicted in movies and media, historically, Asian American women were portrayed in different ways. And as an outgrowth of sort of this dichotomy of West being masculine, the East being feminine, you know, the most common stereotypes of Asian American women were sort of this compliant, unplaying women who are eager to please white Western men, or the malicious, seductive dragon lady. And the common examples for that are Hollywood star, you know, Anna Mae Wong. She was sort of the, you know, this starlet 20s, and really well known for embodying both stereotypes. So the passive butterfly and the dragon lady, which were only roles that remained available to her at the time. Even if she tried to seek out roles that went beyond those stereotypes, she was there was a lot of backlash, and she wasn't cast for a while. So, this was in the 20s, so it's still pretty recent. And you know, movies like Madame Butterfly, Saigon, Full Metal Jacket, which, you know, it's this infamous scene of a Vietnamese prostitute who is soliciting a group of American men in the Vietnam War. She says, "Me love you a long time." And really, these historical and current representations serve to objectify, godify, and dehumanize Asian women, turning us into passive objects of sexual delight, white Western men, public consumption, but also presenting us as lesser than. And if people like us were represented on screen at all, more often than not, were rendered invisible, erased. And these days, unfortunately, the tide seems to be turning in our favor in terms of media representation, you know, with actresses like Michelle Yeoh playing powerful, complex, fully human Asian women in movies like Shang-Chi, Crazy Rich Asians, and Everything Everywhere All at Once. Starting to inch toward this universality of representation, both on screen and behind the scenes, where Asian stories are starting to be seen as human and as universal stories. That being said, there's still a long way to go, and there's still a lot of harm that can be done by narratives that lift Asians as minorities, which is a myth that ultimately strengthens systems of white supremacy. And there's still very much lacking representation of South Asian, Southeast Asian women, Muslim, queer, trans Asian men. That's still problematic. So that's kind of a lot that I went through there. I don't know if Professor Judy wants to add some more context, but not we'll ask to Felicity.
Great. Well, looking back, the immigration history of Asian women was particularly difficult. You know, they were the first group to be ostensibly banned from this country by the Page Act in 1875. Can you explain what led to the legislation that stopped them from immigrating to this country, Professor Wu?
That's a really wonderful question, Felicity. I often talk to my students that Asian immigrants were the first undocumented migrants to the United States, because you can't be undocumented unless there's regulations put against your migration. And the 1875 Page Act, which is sometimes under-recognized in relation to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, that latter act focused on Chinese and Chinese of a particular class workers from coming into the country. And it had to do with the racialized fears about economic competition. But the Page Act actually preceded that in 1875. And that was part of a both racialized and a moral panic. There was fear about Chinese women, Asian women more broadly, becoming prostitutes and infecting the American family, infecting American society. There was a disproportionate gender imbalance in the Chinese immigrant community, as is true for other immigrant communities. The dominant pattern is for male immigrants to migrate first to find economic opportunities and then bring family members. This did not happen in the Chinese immigrant community because of these exclusion laws. And at one point, there were 19 men for every one woman. Some of the women were, in fact, trafficked and brought over as prostitutes. But it's interesting that the law was set in place not so much to support these women, to provide efforts to free them of some of their conditions, but to try to bar them from entry, to prevent them from coming over, and not necessarily, again, to think about compassionately about their lives.
Right. So I am glad to hear the mysterious portrait of Asian women was not a thing of past. It actually persists today. I noticed a couple of years ago, a major European fashion brand created a series of ads featuring Chinese Oriental women with stereotypical physical features like slanted eyes and this really mysterious, ghostly look. So even today, what are the popular perceptions of Asian American women, and what are the forces that continue to shape the perceptions of Asian women, in your opinion, Aftab, Mayor Aftab?
Felicity, I'm so sorry, but I feel so woefully underqualified to contribute to this conversation. I'm very sorry. I totally agree in allyship and in support, but I am just overwhelmed by the information that Professor Wu and Maki is providing. So I would really just love to defer my time to those two to weigh in on that important question.
Sure. I was wondering, as an observer, because we all experience pop culture, fashion, brand representation, and things like that. So you see those forces shaping the perception of Asian women continuously today. And it kind of continues to deepen that perception of Asian women. I thought, you might have some opinion there, but that's okay. Maki, maybe please, you can elaborate on that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was trying to unmute myself. There was a thing there that did not let me to. Yeah, thanks for asking that question. It's interesting that you brought up that, this fashion ad campaign was portrayed Asian women and sort of this ghostly, this ghostly look, because that's actually, one of the most common things that continue to haunt Asian women and really Asians in general. The fact that we're rendered invisible and invisibilized every day in the media. It almost seems like we don't exist or still exist. I want to take that further in terms of these historical representation, how they impact, popular perceptions today. We mentioned, or as I mentioned earlier, Asian women have been historically represented as passive, hardworking, and compliant. And this historical gaze on Asian women as objects for consumption and as invisible objects, really a lot of it stems from, I think, US military involvement and policy in Asia. I'm sure Professor Judy can talk more about that, but it really begs the bigger question for me: how do these post-colonial, imperial histories impact present-day realities? Western intervention in Asia has been around for 100 years, and what Western men were historically considered, sort of the power brokers in this colonial hierarchy. How does that impact global power relations more broadly? It's clear that, in terms of the forces that are shaping these perceptions, foreign economic development, policy, and immigration policy are huge shaping forces. And that's why you have such a high representation of Asian women, fields like nursing, domestic work, home care, etc. And a lot of that is shaped by Asian economies that have been destabilized in part due to American intervention in Asia. And these policies, paved the way for mass immigration of Asian women to the US to work in low-wage jobs, childcare, nursing with few labor protections. And that's, really what you kind of see today. And I can speak as a member of the Filipino American community. There are a lot of Filipino nurses, and there is, there historically there have been policies that have allowed Filipino women to immigrate in huge numbers to the US because of a shortage of nursing care here and certain provisions and advantages that have made for them to immigrate here, but with little support and little protection.
I'll just add a couple of things onto what Maki has shared. I think one, going back to the idea of Orientalism, there tends to be a desire for what is considered forbidden. So throughout American history, there's a fascination with Asian religions, Asian costuming, Asian goods, even as those individuals are being banned from migration to the United States or prevented from becoming US citizens. And in fact, because there is this distance between the West and the perceived East, those objects, material objects, the people who embody them become highly desirable. And so you see this not just in the contemporary times, but also in the past. But I also want to emphasize what Maki was saying, which is about the US military and how the US military presence has fostered these types of fascinations with Asian women. If you think about the long 20th century, like 1898 until maybe even now, right? And you think about the most difficult wars that have occurred. The US-Spanish War, which led to the US-Philippine War, World War II, which was all over the world, but one of the prominent sites was the Asia Pacific. During the Cold War, it wasn't cold in Korea and Vietnam, right? And if you keep on going forward, you think about the War on Terror. Each manifestation of these wars demands a highly mobilized military. And so you have bases throughout different portions of the Asia Pacific. And to help take care of the American soldiers who are serving on these bases, there's R&R districts. There's a whole political economy that's geared towards catering to the sexual desires, the economic needs of the US military. And that in turn has shaped movie representations. There's a really wonderful documentary called Slaying the Dragon, and you can chart how images of Asian women have shifted over time in response to global events like World War II, like the Cold War. So as US military men are being stationed in Japan, there's a wave of movies that look at the geisha. If you think about the prevalence of the Asian prostitute with the heart of gold, that is coming into the forefront in terms of Hollywood, just as there are military bases that are based in those regions of the world. And we still have a very robust military presence. And so that really feeds into the continuation of these representations.
Well, that's certainly fascinating. We talked a lot about the perceptions of Asian women, which can be quite far from the reality. So can each of your panelists tell us something about an Asian woman in your life who either made an impact on you or have a special relationship with you? It can be, your mother, grandmother, sister, friend. Please describe the relationship you have with her and maybe describe the type of person she is. And with this question, we can maybe start with Mayor Aftab, followed by
Okay,
Professor
I
Wu
feel
and
like I can weigh in here, guys. This is my question. Here we go.
Absolutely.
So, thank you, Felicity. Look, I think the most straightforward answer here for me is my mother. I've told my family story a lot, but the simple fact is my mom was quite literally born on the side of a mountain, and because of her perseverance, strength, and courage, I'm in this country with an opportunity to lead. And so all of the stereotypes and the cynical manipulations of the Asian woman in media and military and based on the power structures in this country are completely inconsistent with the woman who raised me and the woman whose courage set up my life, my brother's life, and now my two sons' lives. It always kind of, growing up in a very Asian family and kind of inner community, I was always struck at the inconsistencies of how Asian people were portrayed versus my own personal experiences. And that is, Felicity, in a few instances that they were portrayed, because so much of the challenges that we have as a community is not seeing ourselves reflected in commerce or art or commercialization. But hopefully that is we are starting to become aware of that problem that I agree continues to persist today. And whether it's political or artistically, being more aware of our power and holding people accountable.
Maki, do you want to go next or do you want me to go?
I can go. I feel like it's going to kind of be me with others. So I want to double tap what Mayor Aftab said. She really has had a huge impact in my life. And I resonate with what Mayor Aftab said as well about, not seeing the reality of what Asian American women go through in the media and in the public sphere, although that is starting to change a little bit, hopefully, with the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. And I felt like I definitely saw my mom in that role. I think Michelle Yeoh even had kind of like one of the same shirts. It was, I think, very short. But anyway, I just wanted to, I really wanted to lift how much of an inspiration she's been to me and my sister. My dad passed away when I was 10. So in fact, he had to raise me and this by himself. And I'm thankful to come from a family of very strong women in the Philippines. And back in the home country, we have women presidents, or we had women presidents. So it's not like a big deal as it seems to be here. Watching my single mom work abroad in Japan while my sister and I were in the Philippines going to private school gave me so much more appreciation for the ways in which you could be a woman and a feminist and not sort of fit the stereotype of, the tree hugging kind of legs, not excluding those, but just the ways in which you can be a strong woman, quiet, revolutionary in a powerful way. You can be just an everyday woman who has to provide for her family because there's no one else to do. And also, mothers and daughters have this uniquely beautiful and challenging relationship you bring culture into it, it's more complex and nuanced. And, you know, it has been a journey in terms of navigating this relationship, but it's been a really beautiful one. And I think at the end of the day, you know, it is one of the relationships that has impacted me greatly in my life, and she will continue to inspire me in what she's achieved, not just for herself, but for both me and my sister, and giving us choices she herself wasn't able to.
Thanks to both of you. Those are really beautiful tributes to your mother. I'm going to talk about maybe two different groups of people. One is that I just finished a biography of Patsy Takemoto Mink. She was the first woman of color to be in Congress. She ran for the US presidency in 1972. She's the namesake for Title IX, which I think many people don't realize. So Title IX mandates gender equity in educational institutions, and a lot of people associate Title IX with sports, but it's really all aspects of education. It's about admissions, scholarship, employment, housing, as well as the climate of education. So addressing issues like sexual harassment. And it's been so inspiring to write about her life. I did it in conjunction with her daughter, Gwendolyn Mink, who's a political scientist. If any of you are interested, the book has been titled Fierce and Fearless, Patsy Takemoto Mink, First Woman in Congress. And what I found really inspiring about her, three different aspects. One is that she is someone who is in Congress, so she has a seat, or she demands a seat at the table, but she's doing so in conjunction with grassroots activists. And she's trying to figure out how to translate their ideas into legislation. So I think of her as a bridge feminist. Something else I find really inspiring about her is I think about her as an intersectional legislative feminist. So instead of creating these universal laws for the universal subject, which oftentimes is assumed to be white and male, she's thinking about women, she's thinking about workers, she's thinking about people who are impoverished, and trying to find ways that the federal government or the government in general could provide resources, declare principles that we need to live up to. And then finally, she's from Hawaii. She's third generation Japanese American. And I think about that location. Hawaii is the last state, and it's the last state for both kind of political reasons and racial reasons. Just like there's a great reluctance to think about Puerto Rico as potentially a state for the United States. And it was out in the Pacific, and she really thought about her location. So for example, extensive nuclear testing that's been done in the Pacific, the ways in which the US military has such a broad presence. And actually the pathway through the Pacific is really how the United States becomes a global power. In order to have a naval presence, it needs to have way stations on these islands all the way across. And so I think about her location really shaping her worldview, her commitment to environmental justice, to labor justice, gender justice. So I'm going to give you a historical figure of someone I think we should really look at and hopefully look up to. But the other group of people I want to highlight is that I just came from undergraduate student research symposium at UCI. And I was lucky enough to moderate a session of not all my students, but all the presenters were my students. And the youngest one, first year, this is her first time giving a presentation. Others are graduating, and they've been working with me for a couple of years, and I'm just so proud of them. They're our future. They're so bright and so committed, and we practiced before we did the presentation. I loved how the older students really mentored and nurtured the younger ones and just said, "You've got this, you're doing great." Like they were expressing care for each other. And so I just find that to be so inspirational.
Wow. Yeah, those are really wonderful stories. Thank you all. So last year, the Atlanta shooting claimed the lives of 6 Asian women. And today, Ohio remains one of the top 10 worst states for human trafficking. Many Asian women are victims of sex trafficking. Recently, Abolition Ohio, an anti-trafficking organization with the University of Dayton, published a report showing hundreds of illicit massage parlors are actively enslaving immigrants in Ohio. So overall, what challenges do Asian American women face in this country, and what can we do better to protect them? So Mayor Aftab, can you please start with that one?
Thank you. There's no doubt that the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans is incredibly troubling. But what I try to contextualize in this conversation is the fact that in this country, it has always been generally accepted to be racist towards Asian people, going back to the very earliest Asian settlers. And so what we're seeing now and what we're rightly outraged about is not a new phenomenon, but the result of kind of systemic and institutionalized racism against Asian people. What is probably most troubling, however, is the collective shrug from many people in power when confronted with that kind of violence. The Atlanta shooting is a perfect example of that, of folks empathizing with the shooter, trying to understand where he was coming from, rather than kind of denouncing that kind of overt hate and mind-blowing violence. So, I think the way that I personally try to respond to these things is, number one, by educating the pre-existing stereotypes and racism that exists against all Asian people, calling that out when I see it, and trying to be an agent of change. I think the ways that we change those norms is, number one, via representation. The power structures that be continue to have, to this day, an anglicized lens by which they see all issues, and that is largely because there are white Americans continuing to be in charge at various levels of our government, creating laws and taking action from that purview, unintentionally or intentionally. So representation is, I think, incredibly important to start drafting laws and policies and environments that are safe for all people. And more importantly, maybe to actively hold people accountable for their actions. So those are the two ways that I personally am trying to confront this issue. Number one, through education, and number two, by advocacy to get more people, specifically Asian people, elected in positions of power.
Thank you. Maki?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor Aftab, for sharing that. I also want to just add that in addition to sort of lack of representation at the legislative levels and, in the public arena, Asian American women have suffered huge amounts of mental health stigma. We are a population that has high rates of suicide, high rates of anxiety and depression, and the public invisibility of Asian American women just compounds the stigma, prevents folks from seeing the help that they need. We also have the highest rates of leaving the workplace during the pandemic, and in the most extreme case, this translates to Filipino nurses who have been dying of COVID at much higher rates because of the representation of Filipino women in the healthcare and the home care professions. And in Ohio specifically, there was a Policy Matters report that just came out last week, showed that Asian American women, Asian Americans in general, are among the group of workers whose wages are 50% more likely to be stolen from employers, by employers. And in order to combat this, I think, in addition to adding representation at these higher levels, I think it's also important to participate bystander trainings. There are some great organizations nationally and regionally. For example, Asian American Advancing Justice organization that conducts these free bystander trainings where you can directly intervene if you see a hate crime taking place in front of you, and they do this on a pretty regular basis, and they're available on their social meet them. So those are really great resources to have and to speak up if you see discrimination that's happening.
Thank you so much for your responses. I was going to share that one of the research groups that presented today were supposed to do a public presentation the day after the Atlanta shooting. And we decided not to hold that public presentation and instead create a space for us to share what we were experiencing, to share our pain, to learn from that particular experience. And I was so moved to hear one of the students refer to that as an example of the type of care that we exhibit towards each other. And I think that's what we need collectively. This particular project is using a methodology called photo voice. It's using photography and storytelling to share some very deeply personal reflections about our place in the world, our values. It's a really wonderful methodology that maybe you might even share amongst yourself. You can do this within the community. You can think about sharing something that's very important to you, that reflects your own culture and your heritage, your ideas about the community. So I'm so proud of the students because they talk about the importance of care and resilience, especially in light of suffering and in light of hate. The Stop AAPI Hate group, which has been trying to document hate incidences, has indicated that the number of hate incidences have actually gone up. They have not decreased. They began in 2020 and the incidents continue to escalate. And in fact, about 2/3 of those incidents, at least the ones that are reported, have been targeted towards Asian American women. So I think those historic and contemporary anxieties about race, gender, and sexuality continue to trouble us and motivate some people, unfortunately, to act in very violent and hurtful ways. So I guess one suggestion I encourage all of you to think about is not just listening and sharing with each other, which I think is so important, but to think about what we're offering in terms of our next generation, what is being taught in schools. Are there materials that really reflect the full diversity of the people who live in Ohio and live in the United States? Are our students being taught to respect, to grapple with difficult questions, to figure out ways that they can appreciate and also resolve conflicts? I just want to share this very beautiful experience I had last week, and I'm actually going to go back next week. I went to a middle school in California. They invited me for Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and they created this beautiful banner with like butterflies and Christmas lights. And the students actually created a little pamphlet about me and about Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So they had information about when the month or the week began. They had statistics about Asian American Pacific Islanders. The teachers were saying that it's not a very diverse school, which is why they wanted to have this type of event, and they want to do this for different racial and cultural communities. And I was just so touched by the students, like they put so much effort into welcoming me. The reason I'm going back is that there was a fire alarm that went off. So I talked to the 8th graders, but I'm going to go back next week and talk to the 6th and 7th graders. But I think we're all hungry for these types of opportunities of genuine sharing and learning. And it'd be wonderful to actually have that integrated into educational experiences as opposed to, an optional activity.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your commitment to bring awareness to the challenges of Asian American women and also trying to find solutions to overcome those challenges. I'm sure we will make progress together. Last year, Michelle Wu was elected as the first female mayor in Boston, as we elected Mayor Aftab as the first Asian American mayor in the Midwest. Wonderful events that we should feel very proud of. But what's the election of Michelle Wu mean to the Asian American woman and to the perception of this demographic? Mayor Aftab, do you care to respond to that one?
Yes, actually just yesterday, I was on stage with Mayor Wu and Vice President Harris for a AAPI celebration at the Kennedy Center. And, what Mayor Wu's election means to me personally is progress and pride. But it's also a firm sense of responsibility. I was reading someone's analysis of Justice Jackson's confirmation hearings, and couldn't help but compare Mayor Wu with Justice Jackson, because the commenter was saying when you're first, you're often required to be not just the best, but perfect. And when I see Mayor Wu and everything that she has accomplished throughout her extraordinary life, both personally, professionally, and academically, it inspires a lot of pride, but it also inspires a lot of responsibility that she may be the first because she is perfect or near perfect, because she has worked so very hard. But if she is the last, that will be a failure for all of us. And so there is almost a redoubling of the efforts to ensure that Mayor Wu and Vice President Harris, while they are trailblazers, like the legacy of Congresswoman Mink, that path continues to blaze.
Maki?
Yeah, I think, from a personal perspective, someone who's working in community organizing, it was incredibly empowering for me to see Mayor Wu being elected. It really showed me a public face, and really was public validation that Asian American women can get involved in politics, community organizing, and activism, and be a public figure. It really combats the perception that Asian American women can't be powerful leaders, right? There's a stereotype that we're sort of just the worker bee in the background, kind of plugging away things, without being, the public face of things. And it just goes to show that, we are politically active, we are progressive, and we are out here making change for our communities. And it reflects our growing political power in America. We are being activated as the fastest growing ethnic population, and our votes count. That is kind of the next sort of stage of work that our communities have to get involved in, to become politically aware and to really get plugged in and to see how we can make a difference at the local level. Because we can't all Mayor Wu's, right? And I think, at the individual community level, have realized what are the ways that I can get involved, like organizations that I can help volunteer for, these simple ways of getting plugged in. And I'm really lucky to be part of an organization like OPAWL, that attempts to elevate every day Asian men and build power with them and for them, activate them in order to be agents of change. I think it's really sort of the future of the movement for this community, activating just regular people, students, other workers, professionals, etc., so we can get more powerful in this country.
Yeah, I really support what Maki and Mayor Aftab have shared. I think about what Maki has said before about the need for to recognize and honor everyday people and the importance of the grassroots. And that's something that I definitely saw with Patsy Ming's career, that you can't do it alone. It has to be a community that really supports and demands these issues. And so having gatherings like these are so valuable because you can form connection with each other and you can hold each other accountable, right, for your ideals, and then also push more collectively towards the society that you want to create. So I just wanted to end by maybe sharing something that Patsy Mink said when she passed away in 2002. That was the 30th anniversary of Title IX. Now we're at the 50th anniversary. And she talked about how transformative that policy was, but that also sometimes for the younger generation, they don't necessarily recognize it took such effort to not just pass, but to defend the policies. And so she talked about the importance of vigilance, that's part of what it means to be part of a democratic society, that we need to be concerned. We need to make sure that the values that we hold dear are the ones that are actually ones being upheld more collectively. And I think that sense of steadiness constant involvement is so important. She's talked about the fact that she didn't win every issue. She didn't win every race, but she always had this belief that she could make a difference. And so that's something I think for all of us, I think that can be very inspirational.
Great. I think to the audience online, some of them may want to know what are the ways to combat stereotypes and hate against Asian American women. Do you have any suggestions? We can start with Maki maybe, followed by Mayor Aftab and wrap up by Professor Wu.
Sure, thanks, Felicity. I just really want to reinforce, what I said earlier about taking part in bystander intervention trainings. They are widely available. You can go to Asian Americans Advancing Justice, their social media, and they are, holding these sessions on a regular basis to see how, to just kind of do this on an individual level, and something that will help you kind of directly intervene in the moment. But I think from sort of a more data kind of general perspective, we need aggregated data for AAPI communities. We are not a monolith. We have different experiences, different histories, different stories. I think it's going to be really important to start teasing those out, especially as we continue to battle these stereotypes, generalizations that come from our communities. So that's one sort of academic way to do it. The second way is just, to be a regular human being, you know an Asian person and you would like to be friends with them, just really get to know them, hear their stories, and as much as possible, try to be patient with them as as they learn how to give voice to their stories, to their experiences. As in the past, I think Asian women have not been given the opportunities to tell their own stories, and a lot of that is because of the lack of opportunity to do so, but also because we haven't been encouraged to do so. And I think there needs to be sort of level setting there and patience, that you're not necessarily going to come out sort of this dominant narrative that you're telling, that are different ways to communicate, and Asian American women can communicate differently, and there needs to sort of space for that in the public discourse.
Yeah, I want to follow up on Maki's comments. This question is even more important for those of us here locally, because the AAPI community in the city of Cincinnati is around 2 to 3%. So because our community is so small, we are more susceptible to being victims of these stereotypes, because there's not necessarily institutional support or community to push back forcefully. And so genuine allyship, means sharing your privilege, your power with the AAPI community in small and big ways, finding opportunities to make room and lift up and support the community is critically important. But from my perspective, what is most important, which will address the stereotypes and which will address the lack of community in many ways, is growing the number of AAPIs in the tri-state area. If it's not only important for the AAPI community, in my view, but it's important for Cincinnati. If we want to be a global destination for young, diverse talent, we have to start reflecting not just the rest of the country, but the rest of the world. And I'm going to do everything I can from an economic development perspective to welcome those young, diverse families, but most importantly, to be a community that is sticky and retains them.
Absolutely. Mayor Aftab, we will count on you to make it happen. It's, sometimes not just economic development opportunities, but also making this area multicultural, diverse, welcoming, and all that, right? So, Professor Wu, please.
I think these are really wonderful ideas and suggestions. I really want to emphasize the need to hear one another and tell each other stories. One of the groups that we helped create at UCI was a Black and Asian feminist reading group. And this is in reaction to the horrific violence that was unfortunately on display, that has long existed in our society in terms of anti-Black violence. In conjunction with the anti-Asian violence and the hatred that was also on display. And there's been historic antagonisms between Black and Asian Americans. And so it was really important for us to be able to create a space where we can reach across racial divides and connect with each other. And we've done different things. We've tried to, a lot of this was virtual, but we're starting to meet in person. So to be able to eat together, to create projects together, to work together. I think doing some of these very daily things that could be extraordinary, they could be project-based, or they can be, just sharing stories of our lives. I think that's so important. And that creates the basis for trust and hopefully long-term kind of coalitional and allyship efforts.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. This is just a wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot from the panelists. But let's see, we have 5 minutes left. Do we have any questions from the audience? I don't see any in the chat, but if anyone wants to speak up or ask a question, you can just turn on your camera. Oh, actually, there's one here. It's from Keith. Was a much greater availability of imported media of all types of written and created by Asian men and women being available to people in this country and around the world. Is this changing how Asian culture is perceived? Is it giving people a positive exposure, or is it creating a new distorted image? Also, does the given Asian Americans new stereotypes or expectations that they have to distance themselves from? Who wants to take this one?
I'll just begin. I think it depends on what representations. So if you think about Crazy Rich Asians, which is kind of a fun romantic comedy, but these people are really well off, right? So it doesn't necessarily reflect the class backgrounds of the majority of people from Asia. There's also been critiques about the ways in which South Asians in particular are depicted in that movie, right? So if you think about Asian American and Pacific Islander as being pan-ethnic categories, and something that Maki was really trying to emphasize, right? There's very distinct racial, cultural experiences. And so only certain representations are being seen. One of my students just talked about Asian American students studying abroad in South Korea. And for women especially, the beauty culture in South Korea is such a dominant presence. So a lot of those ideas are based on whiteness, even though it's based in South Korea, right? So I think just because it's coming from an Asian source doesn't mean that it's not problematic. But I will end on something that I found really empowering, which is Shang-Chi, which I didn't expect it, but there was that lovely scene that was set in San Francisco Chinatown between different generations. And the older generation was speaking Chinese and the younger generation was speaking English. I mean, that just felt like a home scene to me. And I did not expect that to be in a Marvel movie. So I think there's possibilities for alternative representations, but I think we also still need to kind of keep a critical eye.
Absolutely. I cannot relate to Crazy Rich Asians for sure. I don't see myself in that movie at all, but definitely my kids and, I see ourselves in Shang-Chi, much better, truer representation of a typical Asian family.
Look, I don't have an academic lens to view this as Professor Wu does, but just as a consumer of entertainment, my take on the question is it's an extraordinary time to be a consumer of fiction and nonfiction from around the world. I mean, you get, obviously the Marvel movies is one thing, but you see Pachinko on HBO Max, which is just an extraordinary generational but also intersectional conversation about occupation and about culture, to the ridiculous, like Squid Game, which is, I'm sure there's problematic aspects to it, but it's just extraordinary that we get to consume a show made by and for South Koreans in the United States and have it be an international phenomenon. So I agree with the professor, we've got to keep a critical eye, but it's such a cool time to be consuming all of this Asian art.
It's true.
Yeah,
well, there's a specific question. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add to Professor Judy said. I think because it is so relatively new in terms of its growing Asian representation, there's so much more room for new stories to be told, better stories. I'm trying to think, there was that movie called The Farewell that Athena starred in, which I heard from a lot of my Chinese American friends, and they thought that experiences pretty well. And so there's just a wide gamut of media that's starting to come out, and I think it's excited to see what comes next. And I know there will be a lot of critical analyses will come out, but we just need to start producing, start creating.
Yeah, well, I don't want miss the opportunity for asking Mayor Aftab to answer this question, because I want to know it myself as well. So here's a question to Mayor Aftab. How does Mayor Aftab deal with the stereotype and successfully being successfully elected as the mayor? What organization would the city government be in charge in handling complaints?
I think there's like 3 different, very distinct questions.
That's right. Well, why don't you share your secret to success? How do you overcome the stereotype?
Oh, gotcha. Gosh, look, we all deal with racism, both microaggressions and overt racism in our own way. And far be it from me to give people advice on something so incredibly personal. What I have tried to do in politics, which is, a lesson that I learned from actually white politicians, is to be your authentic self. Whether you're, Bernie Sanders or someone who doesn't share his politics, I think what people are drawn to in public service or in politics or leadership is people who act in an authentic way and say what they mean. And so not only does that apply to policies and politics, but it also applies to who you are and how you identify. And as a mixed ethnicity person growing up in Beaver Creek, Ohio, I really struggled a lot with my identity. And so I probably have thought about my own personal identity more than probably the average person, given those challenges. But that time spent analyzing my own identity and figuring out where I fit into this world, both made me more empathetic. I think more able to put myself in other people's shoes, but also gave me a stronger sense of my own identity and self-worth now that I'm an adult. And so that, I think, translates itself to a strength in politics when people are looking for that authenticity.
Well, that's a perfect wrap. Well, thank you so much, Maki, Professor Wu, Mayor Aftab, for such a wonderful, insightful conversation. And thank you all for joining us today. We would also like to extend our gratitude to the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library for providing this platform, for its efforts to celebrating the AAPI Heritage Month with our community, and for its continuous collaboration with GCCCEA. With that, we'll wrap up today's conversation, and I'll wish everyone a great afternoon. See you next time. Thank you.